in all of these opportunities around environmental baseline studies and working very closely with companies to make things happen. And I think that's the great value on bringing this discussion to what happens in the field when we are all of us participating in making environmental, social, and governance in a framework that goes along responsible mining and best practices for communities, for the companies, and for society overall. Epi, welcome. Really nice to have you.
Thank you. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Monica. Thank you, Fabiano and Olga, the organizers. As Monica was mentioning, this is the first of an ESG series, the Environment, Social, Governance series, and we'll be talking about turning environmental and social value for shareholders and stakeholders. Before going into the subject, I would like to point out something that is quite obvious. Nowadays, it's really difficult to come up with something truly new, something that hasn't been invented before, especially in terms of environmental science, sustainability, environmental responsibility, social responsibility, community development, all of that. And this specific webinar is not the exception. There's nothing new, nothing that is not common sense, but it is let's say the sum of the mining experience for the past 50, 70, 100 years of what the human and more than the human, the business sector, what they have learned and what they're trying to accomplish, which is basically turning the environmental and social, as well as other aspects, into value for our shareholders and stakeholders. That's basically our anchor for conducting our business, being responsible to our shareholders and stakeholders, and that includes social responsibility, environmental performance, environmental stewards. And having said that, we'll begin with environmental and social baseline studies. It is not a secret that the development of a mining project is not an easy feat. It is the evolution of a discovery to a deposit and finally to a resource. And this involves several phases and challenges, investments, risks, investigations, etc. And each of this involves making several types of decisions. And all of this, in terms of environmental and technical aspects and social aspects, is in the middle of the financial and commodity tectonics shifting around our project. General concept, it's what is the environmental and social baseline, and what is it important for the success of the project? This is the investigation of the environment in communities within the area around our project site. This is done so to compile and the appropriate data for project planning, design, impact assessment, mitigation, permitting, and foremostly as an active asset for the protection of our investment. Studies that generally include geology, topography, hydrology, water quality, soil, environmental quality, biodiversity, demographics, culture, traditions, expectations from the communities, etc. It's basically the study of the natural and human surroundings that will interact with a potential mining project. This is a topic that is becoming more important as mining continues to include best applicable and best available practices in the governance, environmental, and social conduct. And all of this ultimately reflects in the investments. Environmental baselines and social baselines are very important from the basis of project assessment, provide a record of initial conditions, to acquire a tool to identify and state existing conditions, and support during potential conflicts, either by identifying potential conflicts, preventing conflicts, or even in conflict resolution. back it provides background information for environmental permitting, and it also provides background for operations in terms of mitigation, compensation, and also part of the designs. It's the environment. It's the support for the mine design and planning and execution, and this is from commissioning of a project through operation all the way through closure. We also need to take into account that the environmental impact in mining is subject to real and also to perceived impacts. And a solid environmental and social baseline provides important information to make a difference between those two, what is real and what is perceived, using collected data in the studies. A well-executed environmental and social baseline can ease concerns with surrounding communities regarding perceived impacts at an early stage of the project before these become a source of conflict and a potential serious risk to the project development. We also need to take into account that not all negative impacts in an area are due to mine development, and not all developments present negative impacts. For example, employment, training, capacity building, local procurement, improvement, local infrastructure and security all contribute to higher standard of living for the employees' families and in general for the community. And once we understand through a solid baseline the dynamics of the area, we can also include environmental improvements, reforestation programs, basin management, water availability, water scarcity. It's it really depends on the project siting and the issues that we had identified during environmental baseline work. Some special considerations that we need to take into account when considering that environmental and social baselines are dynamic tools that tend to expand and grow in time in those areas that require further investigation. It's usually not a one-time type of deal. We need to take into account health and safety, staff monitoring, nowadays COVID management, monitoring, prevention for staff and the community, risk prevention, first aid, basic life support, emergency protocols, etc. Budget should also take an important role in the planning process, especially when we consider significant laboratory expenses for water, geochemistry, air emissions, material testing, soil, uh, community talks, community disclosure, community programs, logistics, by taking into account commuting to and from the site while on the site or while on the region, food, lodging, vehicles, local hires, local procurement, and security and all geographic levels and stages of baseline work, especially in Mexico and the rest of Latin America. It is always a good thing to keep in mind the security issues. I would like to also discuss about a conceptual workflow, and the key word is conceptual. This is a very general example of the workflow for an environmental and social baseline where we determine a regional area. We carry out historical analysis of satellite imagery, gather available information in previous studies. We use official data sources, the preparation of models and maps to be validated in the field, determine the project area and potential areas that might uh, expand around the project, as well as a preliminary area of influence or an area that may interact with the project. And then we go into baseline planning for the staff, sampling sites, parameters, frequency, campaigns, etc., before we actually do the field work in different seasons and through several campaigns. Uh, Going into data processing and geographic information systems, all data needs to be provided with the proper interpretation so that we can actually report a baseline that is usable for contractors, for designers, for engineering, for permitting purposes, etc. As I said, this is a conceptual workflow, and we need to be aware that baseline studies must be tailored to each project, uh, and it will vary from one site to another site depending on the size, on the extension, the different potential areas of concern that in that region, etc. We need to take into account the geographic scope. It's usually by scales, and we can consider the project site as the area of interest where the project may take place, including potential areas that would expand the mine if they are known, a preliminary area of potential influence, the regional area where the project is located, and the macro context where that region is located. It might be the country or ecological region or an applicable land ordinance. And all of this needs to be very strategic. In general terms, the baseline intensity of the amount of campaigns and samples and frequency and parameters would usually be very high for the project area and its surroundings, medium to high for the local study area, and medium on a regional scale, except in those areas that may pose certain issues or certain areas of interest that may have some perceived interaction with the project, even though in a scientific matter they will be unrelated. But we would like to include those as part of due diligence for environmental based work. This is also a multidisciplinary approach. An environmental baseline is not something that will be carried out by just a couple uh, consultants in the field. Usually, we need geographic information systems experts, soil experts, biodiversity experts, vegetation and forest engineering, environmental engineering applied in the field, uh, laboratory uh, expert in certain areas, for example, air emissions for dust or water quality in hydrology, hydrogeologists for aquifer characterization, etc. The environmental and social baseline will include data gathering and the interpretation from available sources, field investigations, analysis, and characterization in order to describe, quantify, and foremostly understand the, the dynamics in that area. The socio-environmental trends and issues need to be known so that we can actually decide and plan, mitigate, or prevent whatever issue comes in the future. All of this is carried out at different scales, and we need to consider the areas of interest, potential interactions, and the general dynamics of the region. One important aspect of baseline studies is the structured record of pre-existing conditions before the project is executed. The understanding of pre-existing condition will be used in the identification of those issues relevant to the environment, community, project design, engineering, feasibility, and permitting. Uh, as I mentioned, the size of the study area will be usually defined by the multidisciplinary team, considering physical, biotic, and social criteria. Uh, the baseline will describe existing conditions and dynamics, and data must be relevant for decision making about the site designs, type of process, operation, impact prevention, mitigation, and compensation, similar to avoidance, control, prevention, repair, or compensate, or in terms of IFC, offsets and set asides. As I mentioned, baseline studies must be tailored to the project needs. The siting and stage this is an exercise that will evolve along with the project, and one exercise that will need to be updated as the scope of the project evolves. A solid baseline will provide the grounds for environmental impact analysis, impact mitigation, and a favorable environmental and social licensing. All of this is usually carried out while keeping in mind that the environmental baseline and social studies would be used for other studies, for example, environmental impact statements or social impact analysis or forest surveys, risk assessment, technical reports, pre-feasibility and feasibility, engineering contractors, designs, definition of operating programs in terms of community support, environmental performance, etc. And all of this usually take into account physical characterization, biotic characterization, uh, identification of regional issues, permitting issues, and compliance, not just to Latin America standards, but usually to Canadian or American standards or international standards that we need to take into account and use to improve our project development. What is the best time to consider baseline studies? It's as soon as possible, really. When we when we decide that a potential project development will take place, uh, one of the first tasks that an exploration or mining company should implement once a deposit or an area of interest is identified is to begin a series of environmental and social baseline studies. All of this needs to be very strategic. It doesn't need to take all place all at once. You can start small and build your environmental baseline and social baseline. And as soon as a decision is made to carry out work at a potential mining site, environmental and social baseline should begin at the level and the scope that is appropriate to each stage. As soon as the studies commence, the larger, more accurate, and reliable the data set will be for environmental assessments, planning, mine plan improvements, and a more efficient impact mitigation and compensation. All of this, it basically means that you are adding value to the project. You are reducing risk to the project. You are identifying risks or issues before they actually cause any damage to the project. For example, this is a very, very rough example of an environmental baseline carried out for 1 year at a project where on the first year, we carried out phase one dry and wet season as a scope of work for environmental aspects. Once we carry out environmental baseline, we are able to identify certain gaps and provide also specific components and data for mine engineering and mine planning. And then we continue, we extend the issues that will need further evaluation throughout time or that need to be monitored continuously. It's you start big, you fill in the gaps, and then you improve on the data that needs to be improved for before actually evolving into an operating and monitoring stage. As I mentioned before, it's the environmental and social baseline is needs to be tailored and needs to answer to the project needs, to the project siting, to the project, to each project scale. I have a few examples using as a general metric, thousands of dollars spent for different projects in Mexico. One, it's southeastern Mexico. These are thousands of dollars spent throughout different years for environmental and social baseline. This is a tropical rainforest for a mining project. And in the first couple of years, there was work done for environment and social community before identifying that the technical aspects were a big handicap for that project, and the project was paused until new management came along and they decided to take a look and expand the environmental baseline. Again, coming to the same conclusion that the technical aspects for this project were not uh, favorable at the moment. Another project in a tropical deciduous forest in southeastern Mexico started on a strong baseline work and start building on the environmental investments and social and community development, and continue working on the investment throughout the several years, including all of this is the exploration phase before selling that project with added value. Another project, this is in northern Mexico in a desert area with basically no water and some biodiversity concerns. And we started with environmental baseline, and this environmental baseline has continued to expand for several years, even after initiating operations, because of expansions and identification of new deposits. And basically, the mine keeps expanding, so we need to keep adding data so that we can design accordingly. And another project in central Mexico, it has a different approach. Instead of going with different types of studies for environmental baseline, we just applied maybe one or two topics at a certain time. A couple of years later, we tackle another topic before deciding into a full frame baseline work for that project during an active exploration program. All of this would need to be translated into an environmental diagnosis of the project area. We need to integrate the data in a holistic evaluation that reflects the condition, dynamics, trends, and concerns around the site and the regional study area. This evaluation will allow for a better project integration, mitigation, planning, environmental compensation programs, offsets. The diagnosis will allow for the proper environmental impact assessment during permitting stages. In simple words, when we gather enough data in different seasons, different years, we identify the trends and the issues around the project site. We can plan uh, simple stuff as land acquisition, which is not so simple, really, uh, can be planned and directed in a very strategic manner when we understand our project site and our surroundings and the community. As a conclusion, the benefits of the baseline include ease of mind for the community and authorities based on a solid scientific approach, support in the definition of mitigation and compensation programs, risk reduction for additional environmental and social baseline studies during the permitting process, and the process of approving an environmental impact statement tends to advance in time and in a predictable manner when you know that you have a solid foundation for the studies. Benefits of the baseline studies include, for example, if a financing institution is required, a solid support from environmental and social baselines is required. Due diligence and independent audits can be used to review and validate data. And a well-documented environmental and social baseline becomes an important asset. The current tendency in present and incoming shareholders and investors in the mining sector is the consideration of environmental and social risk as a key factor in deciding whether to invest or not. It's really becoming a core aspect of business development. Mining companies, especially larger corporations, when considering potential joint ventures, mergers, acquisitions, are increasingly demanding for well-documented ESG studies for the target project. In general, and using Mexico as an example, Mexico is a country with a large mining potential. It has increased its role in the economy, in the country economy for the past 10 years. It did slow down last year for obvious reasons, but the potential for mining growth in Mexico is still significant. One aspect that I would like to touch is we need to align sustainability with our core competencies. We need to identify risks and opportunities, and all of this is while thinking about adding value to the project. Adding value, it's basically we reach the project potential in a timely fashion while reducing risk. If we know the issues around the site, it's easier to plan and prevent. It's easier to identify potential conflicts or resolve those conflicts. And this is where I would like to come up with a couple quotes from some guys that know about investments and money and the mining industry, not just the scientific aspects that are my area of expertise. From BlackRock, Larry said that over time, companies and countries that do not respond to stakeholders and address sustainability risk will encounter a growing skepticism from markets and, in turn, a higher cost of capital. Companies and countries that champion transparency and demonstrate their responsiveness to stakeholders, by contrast, will attract investment more effectively, including higher quality, more patient capital. From ICMM, its mining principles will support our members to supply the increasing demand of metals and minerals while giving confidence to customers. It's about encouraging mining companies to embrace good environmental practice, good social and governance requirements, societal expectation for the mining industry will need to encompass a broad range of environmental, social governance challenges. The aim has been to develop a holistic set of requirements that establish a benchmark for responsible mining practices. Having said that, especially when we consider about, for example, BlackRock, this is an example that I would like to place. This is the project in southeastern Mexico that we worked for several years during exploration. In those years, about $15 million were invested in exploration, drilling, community development, community support, environmental studies, water quality studies, hydrogeology, etc. Before the actual engineering came up. This project was not big enough. It was owned by a large mining company that considered the project was not big enough for them. That they did apply a very strong and solid environmental baseline. We identified all potential issues. There were conflicts in that area, social conflicts, even potential blockades from the community, but they were identified. And the project was sold for $154 million to a junior company that knew the issues. They were well supported, they were well studied, and this project materialized, and it's an actual operation on the road to expansion. It's the project is about 3 times what was thought about that time. And one important aspect is that BlackRock owns about 15% of that stake. And that followed after BlackRock, we have other Van Eek, RBC, Invesco. It's investing companies that are paying attention to solid environmental and social baseline studies to document and support and reduce risk. In order to reduce risk, we need to identify the issues. Once we identify, we can plan and prevent those. This is presented in order to answer to the responsible citizen mandate of living a better quality of life in the communities that we touch, while preserving natural resources and while maintaining the integrity of the investment. This is what we jump into some ideas that I would like everybody to take home. Environmental social governance strategy implies the integration of environmental and social aspects at all project stages, even from exploration. Uh, Environmental and social baseline is a project asset. It's not an expense, it's an actual asset. When is it an expense? When you invest, but you come up short. Then it's the data may be useless, and then it becomes an expenditure. Or when you overspend on certain topics, certain areas that you had enough data, then it becomes an expense. Otherwise, if you're strategic about it, it becomes an asset. The absence of a solid environmental and social baseline will result in higher capital expenses. Few mining projects actually become an operation. However, the timely environmental and social investment can reduce that risk. There might be other aspects that are technical or recovery or structural or whatnot, but at least on the environmental and social aspects, we can reduce that risk. And a real project cannot be designed without the proper characterization, understanding, and integration of environmental and social conditions at and around the project. What do I mean by a real project? It's a project that we understand not just a process, not the deposit type, but the dynamics around that project and where we can do other stuff such as the application of environmental programs or community development or installation of buffer areas around the project or identification of issues that need to be accounted for from early stages of project development. Having said that, I think I will open up for questions from our attendees.
Thank you very much, Epi. I honestly think that when you just mentioned the last takeaway, take this as an asset. I believe that we are somehow the industry is getting new to see the work around research and getting into environmental baseline studies and give the value that it deserves as the information that helps the industry to foresee what the opportunities and risks are there. So let's talk a little bit about it. So before we start jumping in more questions, and we would really like to invite you to raise your hand, or if you want to type the question, we would like to learn from your points and your experience. And if you want to make comments to it, this is welcome. When we were thinking on the process of creating an ESG series, and we were thinking to make it practical, so what the work that is done on the ground translates into return of investment, not only for investors, but for communities, for the project itself. So when baselines you were mentioning, Epi, that could be a yes or also no as a good news if it's an investment or not, and you were pinpointing the case of the rainforest. Would you like to expand a little bit about when is good no, that the answer is no? When, because we always like the answer as a yes. What do you think from your angle?
Okay, it goes back to one of my core principles. It's the problem is not the problem. The problem is how you look at the problem. So by having said that, when you have a say rainforest, a tropical rainforest, you may think about biodiversity, but proper management can help you design the project with the buffer area and programs and monitoring on all of that. You can actually mitigate your impact and even improve on that aspect. When is it a good time? And going back to that specific project, when is it a good time to say no to a project? When you don't have the answer to that issue, when you don't have the plan, you don't have the answer. In that specific area, the problem was the size of land in terms of water management, since we had over 35 millimeters of rain per year, which would imply a large, very significant water management program and a safety issue that require additional land that was not available, and it's still not available. Biodiversity is not a big issue when you have the proper protection programs and conservation programs. But the technical aspect in this project was water management. So that was the problem there. And since the engineering department and land acquisition did not have the answer for additional land, that's when you stop a project. When you see an issue and you don't have the answer. Uh, Going back to the other project that was sold, there was an issue. There was a social conflict, and even though there was a social conflict, it was identified. And once you identify it and you can come up with a solution and programs and development, etc., and the new company acted and bought a project that was well documented, including the bad stuff, and they solved it, and they are operating now. And as I mentioned, it is 3 times larger than was previously expected.
Yes, and now another thing comes to my mind, Epi, when we talk about, and this is plenty of discussions that we have together, how environmental and social they work together, and how the factual data of your research and analysis come as the point of intersection to start the dialogue. So let's see from your experience when you have been working with communities in projects that are controversial. How do they perceive the valuable work that you guys do? Is it helping? Is not? How's that?
Uh, Doing environment from the environmental aspect, when you do environmental work, uh, it's also presentation card to the
It is.
communities. It's I'm not here just exploring. I'm not here just doing topography. I'm doing. I'm in the region. I'm measuring and counting trees. I'm monitoring wildlife. Uh, I'm analyzing water quality. I'm doing all kinds of studies. So when the community knows about this, they will be interested. They might be a little concerned about, why are you concerned about water quality? Are you going to affect me? That's when you need to keep the conversation going. No, it's because I do not want to affect your resources, but I need to understand what the resources are before actually designing a project. I will not design a project on the computer and then force it upon the
Mm.
land. I need to understand the land so that I can design. I have seen something as simple as um, walking around and driving around with design contractors, uh, 10, 15 miles away from the project site to around the towns, because they said, I need to get a feeling of what the community is, how they work, the schools, the infrastructure, so that I can design the
Mm-hmm.
the operation in terms of hiring a couple people for that know about programming and they can run the process plant, or hiring and designing a plant that operates with 400 people working on levers. So it comes back to the understanding of the community and education and expectations and capacity building and all of that. And for that, you need to understand the dynamics. It's and I'm lost.
Yeah, no, but it's just brilliant because one of the things that inspire me a lot is that as far as we want to ignore that this is not a craftsman work, the work that you do in environmental, and as you mentioned at the beginning, is every project has its own set of results and all environment, and the whole project itself is a unique piece. So everything has to be designed accordingly. And when I'm thinking on the social angle, it's exactly the same. the culture of one town, it varies to the culture of the exactly next door town, and the reality and the dynamics and what you just mentioned about the living the living experience in each town will shape that impact as well. But one thing that I would like to expand a little bit more, because we will also, in the purpose of the series, we are going to be tackling the next time about social impact. So we're going to be moving on the technical side of social science, and we're going to see it from the other angle. So I would like to invite everybody to join us for the next discussion. Next time we flip places, and Epi sitting in this seat and I will be sitting in Epi's seat. But Epi, let's go back about that discussion that we had a lot, many times, around the use of this data for the entire life of the project. We weren't even talking about that this data can be even useful when you're talking about the closure of the project, because it just shows you the before and after, the commitments that the project should have to have in place when they are talking about land reclamation and so on. So why is so important to start from the very beginning and bring this slowly until the closure, so we have a full picture?
Uh, when you consider a project that is 100% new, I mean, you're just exploring, you have a wide range of opportunities. The alternatives are countless. When you go into operations, you're doing baseline, your alternatives, your options are reduced, and when you go into closure, you have fewer options for the to act in a responsible manner. Going back to the beginning, when you start as soon as possible, you can actually design your project to include as much as possible in a strategic manner the community, or separate yourself from the community, whatever is strategic. Ideally, when you understand a community, employment opportunities, land use, etc., you can try to provide some support to build economies that are parallel to the mine site, and not fully dependent on the man site on the mine site. It's great when you see, oh, we are employing 95% of the town. My question is, what happens to that town when you stop mining?
Mm-hmm.
But if you become a neighbor, not the anchor of that community, but a good neighbor, it's a different story, and that takes place at early stages. Um,
Yes, and
that's
one
that's
thing that, yeah, sorry, sorry, go ahead. I thought that you
that's
finished.
one example. When you have a project and you're surrounded by uh, agricultural land, well, you need to understand what your impact will be on that land. If you acquire additional land, there may not be displacement of a community, but you're displacing certain activities. And while they might be well compensated, those activities may move the agricultural frontier further, and you will cause indirectly other types of impacts. Um, uh, so it's really about understanding what the people do, how they operate in that region, and how your project can become a part of that community, not as a government figure or anything like that. You will be another neighbor. You're not the leader. You're not responsible for building a, say, a hospital or a highway or something like that. But you can add yourself to the community and help them achieve certain goals that will be strategic also for the project and the investment.
Yeah, one of the things that is interesting when we talk about turning the work that we do into value for shareholders. Here, there is a couple of things that companies could might miss, and is separating us. And there's so many times that the work done in environmental could be, if shared, could be information that the community could use in their benefit. You were talking about water, measuring the rainy season, in case of agriculture in so many communities, at the same time the use of energy. All of these elements are pieces that come from the good work and environmental that can translate to the benefit of the communities if we manage the transition and work with the communities around that. And also, as you mentioned, in the case of agriculture, it helps to diversify that scenario. We have also talked about ideas of when we measure the wind, when we measure rain, when we measure, this is also information that if we just keep it locked in the mind side, we are missing the opportunity to help communities. Some ideas that probably we can share with our attendees that they might like to consider for their sites.
You have another piece of a recommendation. It's you will not find one single consultant that can provide a full set of answers to every topic, to every issue, especially when you can take into account, say, hydrogeology or atmospheric modeling, it's or water quality or biodiversity and social studies and engineering and designs and programs, all of that. It has to be a multidisciplinary team, and not just for baseline, but for the users of the baseline work and within the community. And everybody needs to understand and be on board about sustainability goals and how to use that information, etc. It's and let's not be also, uh, let's say, uh, overexcited about certain aspects. It's better to go one step at a time, be very strategic, be very systematic about it. I've seen some projects that would like to jump into very advanced models before we actually get enough data, and usually data that takes over a year to collect. And after a couple months, they want to go into full frame modeling, which can be done, but that will be an over expense because you don't have enough data to actually support that model. So let's go with a partial model, step by step, identify issues, and build on those issues as they come or are being identified by the different experts in water quality, in dust deposition, or community issues, or I don't know, it's security issues, everything that goes around the site and around and in that region.
Yeah, well, we have somebody from the audience ready to ask a question. Let me just invite Rob Rob Corpati to participate and just how can I unmute Rob? Just one sec.
Hello, Rob is already unmuted as he wants,
Okay.
as we have the teams.
So Rob, thank you for joining us.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, great to have you with us. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. It's been a very interesting webinar. I've really appreciated it. And I don't have a question, I just want to make a comment. You and Epi talked a couple of minutes ago about thinking about environmental engagement as creating an asset. So it's really a investment that creates an asset. And that makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that would make a lot of sense to mining executives in general, because there are so many risks reduced, whether it's PR, whether it's legal, whether it's conflict. If water has a problem and can't be used, imagine the conflict and imagine the economic benefit of making that go away. So it really makes good sense from my point of view, at least, to think about it as an investment, because it makes a bunch of risks evaporate when done properly. Also makes a bunch of benefits kick in, because all of a sudden everyone's at the same table thinking about thinking about the project collectively. So thank you very much. Just wanted to share that thought.
Thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Rob. I think it's very important. And one thing that we have been working with Clifton, and the effort that we want to make is that we want to move the risk from the fear to the solution. And that's exactly the quote that Epi likes to put, is how you see it. And nothing different in many other disciplines around mining, finance, even legal. When you really understand and you have a full assessment and full picture of the scenario, can be a very good decision just to say no. I have also done due diligence on projects around social that it will be extremely costly for the project, or even is not operational, just to land in that risk area. And it's the same in the case of mine, of environmental. Is anybody else would like to join us with some question or a point that you would like to make? Okay. Well, so thank you very much to all of you. Sorry for the technical challenge that we face, and thank you very much for your patience in that go for the next click to solve this issue. That's the best attitude ever. We would like to invite you to the next series. So in this series, as we mentioned, we are going to be going. Oh, we said that we have a question here. They just tell me somebody has a question. Oh, before I close, Pragna, I understand you have a question. Would you like to go ahead? Hello. Hi.
Hello.
Hello. Pragnesh left a comment on our text.
Yes.
On the chat. Yeah, I'm gonna read it so we can talk about it. Hi, thanks for the interesting section. I'm a student and was recently studying about remediation and cleanup methodologies of various sites in case of mining accidents. As you were presenting, I realized how useful solid baseline studies can be in those situations too. Quick actions are necessary and it can save companies and communities from bigger damages.
Yeah, I can comment on that. When we need to separate a little bit from one thing is environmental, one thing is design and planning, and environmental baseline and environmental mitigation or prevention. Another thing is accidental or risk assessments. They are all parts of the sustainable development and sustainable planning. It's key aspects. You need to understand your project site in terms of topography, seismology, climate, meteorology, um, extraordinary events, and as well at the size and capacity. I would assume that we are discussing here about say tailings rupture, tailings failure, and you need to understand what's downstream from your tailings. That's also part of the baseline, so that you know what the water bodies, streams, rivers, communities, land use, forests, resources, etc., exist. So when you actually come into a model that will tell you the extent of a potential failure, you can come up with programs that involve those communities uh, response for response or emergency actions. In between, we have designs, engineering controls, engineering monitoring, seismological monitors, or you're continuous. You need to operate that tailings impoundment in a responsible manner, so that it's when you're close to when your risk increases, you should have identified and you can act on it before it actually materializes into an emergency. So it's having said that, engineering an operation should take it should play its part in the prevention of an emergency or an accident, but programs need to involve the community, because community response will be needed in the event of an accidental release, and you need to coordinate with local authorities, with the community, with I don't know, if there is a town or city or something. They should have the the protocols to respond in order to prevent damages to, especially to to the community, to the lives.
Okay. Yes, Fabiano?
Hello. I just wanted to make a comment and probably a question for both of you around timing. And we had these discussions several times with the work. Um, Many times in projects, they just start to see the social and as well the environmental as a point of importance or a point that they need to take action once the legality of the projects are already done or once the stage of the project has already shown that they have a mining potential. But many times we see that because it passes too long to get to that stage, you already have social issues or you already have environmental issues that should be taken care in the beginning. How do you guys see that, or how do you guys see the value of having environmental and social so early on projects sometimes?
It's the early it's better to identify the issue or a potential conflict before it actually materializes into an actual conflict, or it's not something you want to trip over. It's something you can see in the road ahead, and you can move around that boulder that will trip you, or move that boulder, or do something about it. So as early as possible, it is always better. Sometimes we need to apply environmental and social baseline work when a conflict already exists. So it's, let's say, a mine site that is being accused for polluting a river. They have been operating for 6, 7 years, and they are being accused for that. So, and they argue that they are compliant with the laws, and they have water treatment plants and recycle water. So we need to jump into baseline work, which is this type of due diligence to see what the water quality is, what the wastewater is from what the mine discharges are, and what are the existing discharges upstream and downstream. What is the land use around that? So what other activities exist, agricultural activities or garbage dumps or cities or something, so that we can actually validate the claims that the mine site is responsible or is not responsible, or that everybody is responsible about it and everybody should be on board, and we should not be fighting about it, but we should be designing a joint venture between the community and the mine site and the government to for water management and water quality from a basin, from a micro basin uh, criteria.
Yeah. And I would like to go. I'm not. I mean, totally agree with Epi. The earlier the better. But at the same time, there are many cases when mergers and acquisitions happen that the new acquired they get an inherit challenges. Some other cases, the industry inherit challenges that are not mining, that are agriculture related, or the 200 years ago something happens. Even the Spaniards had been part of the challenge in Latin America and things like that. But I think that when you just jump into facing these conflicts that are happening, it is also wise to acknowledge what is happening and do a very educated analysis around that, around diagnosis from the environmental and from the social component to identify the root cause of issues. And that is when the both science meet in the middle to help projects in identifying that. Because if you put it in perspective, in my experience, communities also get tired of the conflict, but they're sometimes companies they don't know how to address the conflict, or companies just ignore the conflict, or they don't go into a very professional diagnosis of what the root cause of the issue is. So even if we just inherit that challenge and we have that problem, we can go back to science to start remediating the issue and putting that as a common ground so everybody understands what is happening and use it as a new point for the discussion or for the conversation to restart or at least to understand. So from that, in our experience at Trade, we found that helps communities and the relation with companies a lot. Monica has a question. Hola, Monica. Hi, Monica.
Buenas tardes.
Hola.
Gracias. Epi, I have a question. What do you think will be the main parameters that will determine the size of your study area? Because we are talking about environmental and social assessment. So would that be more the catchment, biodiversity, community?
There is a term that sometimes it's being used, but for baseline, it will be too early, but we can still make a reference as it will be an environmental system, which is basically the different types of vegetation that are related, water bodies, topography, catchment basins, and understanding what the project concept is. Underground versus open pit mining, potential expansion areas. The topography of that region is also very, very important. Probably the main aspect would be the topography. I've seen projects that in mountain regions where the catchment basins are somewhat small. So and you start adding a bunch of these micro basins to come up with a suitable large enough region study area that allows you for the design, for the interactions, for potential impacts, for the design, for land acquisition, etc. And you get the proper understanding. And other projects in very flat areas that expand to some study areas that are over 200,000 hectares in size, so really, really big. But let's not be too scared about a very large study area, as long as we're strategic about it. Not all of the parameters, not all the topics need to be exerted or exercised in detail for all of that area. Yeah, you can be strategic. Some mountain ranges can have a little more work on, say, biodiversity or water or springs or other stuff. So lower lands, maybe that's the concentration of wells. So water quality, water availability would be more of an issue in those areas. But you need to understand the trend and the dynamics in that study area. So catchment, topography, hydrology, land use, communities, satellite communities that will have a direct interaction with the project would also need to be included in that project definition or study area.
Wow, that's very good. Well, I would like just honestly thank you very much, everybody. We need to wrap up. Thank you, Epi. This is fantastic, and I'm very happy that we were able to share with you the many times that we have really interesting conversations at the interior of our teams and colleagues. So the next in the series, as I mentioned, we're going to be talking next time. We're going into social impact assessment. Next time, a very good friend and colleague of ours, Monica Rovello from Valor Sostenible, will join us. We are working with Monica very close on social impact assessments, and Epi will be sitting in this seat as moderator. And the next in the series will be permits. And this is interesting because this is the time that the three of us, I mean, we're going to be joining efforts, the three of us, about what is permits from the environmental, what does it happen with social, that in some cases are voluntary, and some countries start taking an action around making much more mandatory for permitting, but equally that community and social approval, it comes into place even for the work that environmental does. And the last in the series is what happens from operation to closure. So we will be very happy to welcome you again. And if you want to share this with your friends and colleagues, we will be posting this in LinkedIn. So you guys are more than welcome to join us. So thank you very much and happy Wednesday. Thank you, Epi.
Thank you, guys.
Y a todos los amigos en América Latina, muchas gracias a todos. Adiós.
Gracias, Mónica. Bye.
Bye.
Gracias, Epi.
Gracias.
Adiós,
Thank you.
gracias. Feliz tarde.
Igualmente.